Silence wasn't a choice for Mia Blackthorn. It was a prison she wasn't born without a voice. No. Her voice was a gift that was stolen, stripped away by those who feared what she might say. In a world where wolves rule through absolute power, where your only worth is measured by the strength of your claws and the ferocity of your spirit, Mia had nothing, no voice to command, no wolf to protect her, no place to belong. She was beaten by a cruel fate and broken by the very bloodline that should have shielded her. For years, she lived as a ghost, a hollow shell haunting the corridors of the house her father once ruled. But every tragedy has a breaking point. Everything changed on the coldest night of the year, the night the most feared alpha in the north, Hunter Nightfang, stepped into her world. He didn't just see her. He heard her. He felt the vibration of a silent scream that no one else was capable of sensing. And in that moment, he didn't just claim a prize. He claimed a mate. The pack calls her worthless. They call her weak, but they are blind to the truth. Mia Blackthorn isn't a victim waiting for a savior. She's a hidden power, a storm gathered in the lungs of a girl who has finally found a reason to breathe. She is the rise they never saw coming. If you find yourself drawn to deep, emotional werewolf stories filled with betrayal, forbidden romance, and the kind of revenge that burns through the pages, then you are in the right place. Before we descend further into the shadows of the Blackthorn lineage, make sure to subscribe and like this video. Stay with us until the very end, because this story will shatter everything you think you know about alpha bloodlines. Chapter 1. Long before the silence became a cage, Mia Blackthorn was a child of the moon and a daughter of power. Her father, Alpha Darius Blackthorn, ruled the Moonveil Pack with an authority that was as undisputed as the rising sun. To the world, he had only one daughter, Giselle Blackthorn. She was the golden child, perfect, admired, and destined for greatness. But hidden in the shadows of that perfection was the truth. There was Mia. She was the firstborn, the daughter of a love the pack never accepted. In a world built on rigid hierarchy and ancient traditions, Mia was a sin. Still, Darius loved her. He loved her quietly, in the stolen moments between his duties. He loved her carefully, as if she were a flame that the wind might extinguish at any moment. But love, as Mia would soon learn, is not the same thing as protection. The day Darius died, the pack lost its leader, but Mia lost her world. Power does not remain empty for long. It is a vacuum that demands to be filled, and Genevieve Blackthorn did not hesitate to claim what was left behind. Genevieve was beautiful, elegant, and possessed an ambition that was far more dangerous than any claw or fang. She stepped forward and seized control of the Moonveil Pack. But ruling wasn't enough for her. She needed certainty. She needed to ensure that the future belonged solely to her daughter, Giselle. And Mia. Mia was the only shadow left in her light. Under the cover of a moonless night, Genevieve ventured into the forbidden forest, a place where even the bravest wolves feared to tread. She sought an ancient power, a witch who watched the world with hollow, sightless eyes. When the witch asked what she desired, Genevieve didn't flinch. She didn't offer a mother's mercy. She simply said, "Take her voice, and make sure she never rises." The price for such a curse was heavy, but Genevieve considered it a bargain for the crown. The next morning, Mia woke up and tried to greet the day. She opened her mouth to breathe, to speak, to cry out. But there was nothing. No sound, no scream, not even a whisper. Her voice was gone, stripped away by a darkness she couldn't see. And as the days bled into weeks, a deeper horror set in. Her wolf, the spirit that lived within every member of her bloodline, never arrived. It was as if the curse had silenced her soul as well as her throat. From that moment on, the pack stopped seeing the alpha's blood in her veins. They stopped seeing the girl who had once been loved by a king. They looked at her and they saw nothing. Mia Blackthorn became a ghost in her own home, a prisoner of a silence that was never meant to be broken. Chapter 2. The whispers were the first thing to pierce her soul, spreading like a slow-acting poison through the pack. Then came the laughter, sharp and jagged, designed to draw blood without ever leaving a mark. Wolfless, useless, a defect in the bloodline. Giselle made sure the words never stopped. She wore her cruelty like a crown, humiliating Mia at every turn and mocking the very silence that Genevieve had engineered. And while Mia's sister laughed, her stepmother simply watched, satisfied. To Genevieve, Mia was no longer a person. She was a servant, a shadow, a girl who had been stripped of her voice in a world that only listened to the roar of the powerful. But deep within the hollow spaces of Mia's chest, something was starting to shift. It wasn't a wolf, not yet, but it was something ancient, a slow-burning heat that refused to die. As the years bled into one another, Giselle's ambition grew alongside her beauty. To secure her future, she set her sights on Lucien Draven, a warrior whose reputation for strength was matched only by the fear he inspired in his enemies. Lucien was charming, yes, but it was a thin mask. He didn't look at Mia with the pity the others felt. He looked at her with a dark, calculating intent. He saw a girl with no voice to cry for help and no family to demand justice. To him, she wasn't a human being. She was an opportunity. The night it happened, the moon hung heavy and pale in a sky that felt too quiet. Mia walked through the trees alone, sent on another meaningless task that was nothing more than a punishment in disguise. The forest usually felt like her only friend, but tonight, the air was thick with a strange, suffocating dread. She felt the shift in the wind a second too late. A hand clamped over her mouth, a cold, bruising grip that forced her head back. Lucien. His eyes were predatory, devoid of any warmth as he dragged her into the deeper shadows. Mia fought with every ounce of strength she possessed. She scratched, she kicked. She tried with all her might to let out a scream that would shatter the trees, but there was only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Lucien smiled against her ear, a sound more terrifying than any growl. Her silence was exactly what he wanted. Then, the world stopped. The air didn't just shift, it froze. The wind died in the branches. Even the insects went still as a low, bone-deep growl echoed through the clearing. It wasn't a sound of hunger. It was the sound of absolute, lethal judgment. Lucien went rigid. He knew that sound. Everyone in the north knew it. Hunter Nightfang stepped out of the darkness, his presence so massive it seemed to pull the very light from the clearing. His eyes locked onto Mia's, and for the first time in her life, the world didn't feel empty. In that heartbeat, the atmosphere shattered. A bond, violent and unbreakable, snapped into place with the force of a tidal wave. It was primal, it was terrifying, and it was final. Mate. Chapter 3. Hunter moved like a literal storm, a force of nature that didn't just fight, it decimated. Lucien Draven, a man who had built a reputation on being feared, didn't stand a chance. Within seconds, the warrior was on the ground, broken, bleeding, and reduced to begging for a mercy that Hunter Nightfang was not known for possessing. But Hunter wasn't looking at his enemy anymore. His attention was anchored on the girl standing in the shadows. Mia stood there, her small frame shaking, her lips pressed together in that eternal, haunting silence. But something about her pulled at him, something far deeper than the primal instinct of the wolf. He walked toward her slowly, his heavy boots crunching on the forest floor, and when he reached her, he didn't hesitate. He pulled her into his arms. He was strong, he was protective, he was possessive. And when he leaned down to whisper the words, "You're mine," it wasn't a suggestion. It was a decree written in the stars. Hunter had faced wars. He had killed enemies without a flicker of hesitation and ruled his territory without an ounce of mercy. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had ever unsettled him like Mia Blackthorn. She was an enigma. She didn't speak. She didn't beg for her life or cling to him like a damsel in distress. She just looked at him with those quiet, aching eyes. And somehow, that affected him more than fear ever could. He took her back to his territory that same night. He didn't treat her as a prisoner, and he couldn't see her as a burden. She was something far more dangerous. She was something he realized with a tightening in his chest that he could never let go. Later that night, in his private chambers, Mia stood by the window. The moonlight rested softly on her face, making her look like a creature made of silver and shadow. Hunter watched her from across the room, studying the way she breathed, the way she seemed to occupy the silence. "Say something," he muttered, the command leaving his lips before he could stop it. He paused, the weight of his own mistake hitting him. He remembered. She couldn't. Mia lowered her gaze. Slowly, with hands that trembled like leaves in the wind, she reached for a piece of parchment and a quill. She wrote a single line and handed it to him. When Hunter took it, his thumb brushed hers, and the spark of the bond nearly floored him. He read the words, "Thank you for saving me." Something shifted in his expression, the iron mask of the Alpha softening just enough for her to see the man underneath. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You're my responsibility now." Mia frowned, not out of hurt, but out of a sudden, sharp confusion. She took the parchment back and wrote again, "Responsibility or choice?" That question hit deeper than she could have intended. Hunter didn't answer. He couldn't. Because the truth was, he didn't know where the bond ended and his own heart began. The days that followed were a blur of distance and tension. Mia stayed in the Alpha's quarters, caught in a strange limbo. She wasn't a servant, she wasn't an outsider, but she wasn't quite his Luna either. Hunter kept his distance, not because he didn't feel her, but because he felt her too much. Every time she was close, his control slipped. Every time she looked at him, that quiet pull in his chest tightened until it was a physical ache. And Hunter Nightfang was a man who survived by never losing control. But Mia didn't see his struggle. All she saw was the distance. All she felt was the cold weight of uncertainty. One night, she sat alone on the stone terrace under the moon, hugging her knees to her chest. She was lost in a sea of thoughts that she had no way to voice. Hunter found her there. Of course he did. The bond was a compass that always led him back to her. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, stepping into the light. Mia didn't look at him. She simply opened her small notebook and wrote a sentence that broke something deep inside him. "I've always been alone." Without thinking, Hunter stepped closer. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, but not quite. "Not anymore," he said. His voice was low, certain, and carried the weight of a vow. Mia slowly turned to look at him. Their eyes met, and this time neither of them looked away. The tension between them shifted. It was no longer just about protection or instinct. It was something deeper, something dangerous, something that neither of them was ready to understand. But neither of them could escape. Chapter 4. They were not alone in this forest. In the world of the Moonveil, every glance is a currency, and every moment of softness is a weakness to be exploited. Freya Voss had been watching from the periphery, her eyes tracking every shift in Hunter's posture. She saw the way his shoulders lost their rigid edge when Mia entered a room. She saw the way his focus, once a singular weapon aimed at his enemies, now drifted toward a girl who couldn't even speak his name. It filled Freya with a darkness that tasted like iron and ash. "A mute girl?" she whispered into the cold night air, the words bitter on her tongue. "That is who he chooses over me." Freya had been forged in the fires of pack politics. She had trained her entire life to be the Luna the North deserved. Powerful, respected, and feared. She was everything a leader should be, and yet Hunter was choosing a ghost. That humiliation didn't just hurt. It fermented, turning from a bruise into a lethal, concentrated hatred. But inside the Alpha's walls, the shift was happening in heartbeats and half-breaths. It happened late one evening on the narrow stone steps of the East Wing. The air was damp, the stones slick with the evening mist. Mia's foot caught on a jagged edge, and for a terrifying second, the world tilted. Before she could fall into the dark, a heavy iron strong arm caught her. Hunter pulled her back against him with a force that was both protective and possessive. For a long, suspended moment, they froze. They were too close, far too close. Mia's breath hitched in her throat, a silent gasp that vibrated against Hunter's chest. His grip tightened, not to hurt her, but to anchor her. To make sure she didn't disappear. Their faces were inches apart, the space between them charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a lightning strike. Hunter's eyes dropped to her lips for a single, fleeting second before snapping back to her gaze. The tension was a living thing screaming to be acknowledged. Then, as quickly as it had formed, the moment snapped. Hunter released her immediately, stepping back into the shadows. His jaw was set so tight it looked like carved stone. "Be careful," he said. His voice was cold, but it lacked the steady, lethal edge he usually carried. It was the voice of a man who was lying to himself. Mia stood on the steps, her heart racing against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt a new kind of heat blooming in her chest. Something dangerous, something warm, something she had no name for. That night, sleep was a stranger to them both. Hunter stood by his window, staring out at the dark expanse of his territory. fighting a war within his own blood. He was an alpha. He was supposed to be in control. But he was losing ground to a girl who didn't say a word. Down the hall, Mia lay in the silence of her room, staring at the ceiling. Her heart refused to settle. For the first time in her life, someone hadn't looked at her with pity. They hadn't looked at her with the disgust of a pack that valued power above all else. He had looked at her like she mattered. And that realization was the most terrifying thing she had ever felt, because Mia knew the world she lived in. She knew that once you found something worth having, the world tried its best to take it away. She had finally found a reason to hope, and she was terrified that the weight of it would eventually break her. Chapter 5. The next morning, the world looked the same, but the air between them had shifted. It was no longer just a bond of fate. It was becoming a bond of choice. Mia stepped onto the training grounds, her movements quiet and hesitant. She didn't belong here, among the sweat and the silver-clad warriors, but she needed to understand this world. She needed to know the shadows she was now living in. The moment she was spotted, the atmosphere soured. The whispers began almost instantly, like the hissing of snakes in tall grass. The alphas, what exactly? She can't even speak. A defect in the bloodline. Mia lowered her gaze, pulling her shoulders in. She was used to it. The weight of being less than was a cloak she had worn her entire life. But then, a sudden sharp silence fell over the grounds. It was heavy. It was immediate. Hunter had arrived. He didn't walk. He dominated the space. His presence alone was enough to suffocate the mockery in the air. He walked straight toward Mia with a deliberate, dangerous stride. Every step he took carried a silent message. She is not to be touched. She is not to be questioned. He stopped so close to her that she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Who told you to come here?" he asked. His voice was low and controlled, but beneath the surface there was a jagged edge of possession. Mia quickly wrote on her pad, her fingers trembling. "I just wanted to see." Hunter's jaw tightened. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at the world that made her feel like she needed permission to exist. Without a word, he reached out and took her wrist. His grip was firm, unyielding, but careful not to bruise. He pulled her flush against his side and looked her in the eyes. "Look at me," he commanded. She did, and then he turned to face the entire pack. His voice carried the weight of a mountain. "From today, she stands beside me. Anyone who disrespects her answers to me." The silence that followed was absolute. In that one moment, everything changed. He hadn't just protected her in the shadows. He had claimed her in the light. Later that day, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a raw, aching tension. Mia tried to slip out of his chambers, wanting to disappear before she became a burden. But she didn't even make it to the door. "Where do you think you're going?" The voice stopped her cold. Hunter was leaning against the wall, his arms crossed, his eyes tracking her every move like a predator. Mia wrote a quick note. "I didn't want to disturb you." He pushed himself off the wall and walked toward her. Slow, measured. "And who said you were disturbing me?" He stopped inches from her face, the air between them thick enough to touch. "You don't leave without telling me. Not in my territory." Mia blinked, her heart hammering against her ribs. She wrote a single word, "Why?" Hunter leaned in, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that sent shivers down her spine. "Because you're mine." It wasn't a romantic whisper. It was an absolute truth. "You don't wander alone. You don't disappear without me knowing." His gaze softened for a fleeting second, but they both knew it wasn't just about the territory anymore. It was about the fact that he was starting to need her as much as she needed him. That night, the bond between them grew teeth. He could feel her fear, her lingering loneliness, and she could feel the ironclad restraint he was using to keep himself from crossing the room. Mia sat on the edge of the bed, her mind a whirlwind of confusion. "Stop doing that," Hunter said suddenly. Mia looked up, startled. "Looking like you're about to disappear," he muttered. He walked closer, his hand hovering near her face for a long, agonizing second before he finally touched her. He brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his touch so gentle it felt like a bruise. Mia froze. It wasn't fear. It was the shock of being seen. She took her notebook and wrote the most honest thing she had ever felt. I'm not used to someone staying. The line hit him like a physical blow. Hunter stared at her, his expression unreadable for a moment before he leaned down, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. Get used to it. In that touch, it wasn't about dominance. It was about a first real crack in the armor they both wore. But across the hall, the darkness was gathering. Freya Voss had seen it all. The closeness, the protection, the way Hunter's eyes lingered on a girl who had nothing to offer a pack but silence. Something inside Freya snapped. This wasn't a passing curiosity anymore. This was a threat to her power, her future, and her throne. A cold, lethal smile formed on Freya's lips as she stared into the shadows. If she won't leave willingly, she whispered to the empty room, then she'll simply have to disappear. Chapter 6. The days that followed were draped in a strange, flickering light. Mia Blackthorn was no longer invisible. Wherever she went, eyes followed her like shadows. Whispers lingered in the air, thick with a mixture of awe and resentment. But no one dared to cross the line. Not after the Alpha's decree, but fear of a king does not stop the ambition of a queen. Freya Voss watched it all from a distance, her heart a cold, hollow chamber. She had tried pride. She had tried patience. But as she watched the way Hunter's gaze softened, the way he looked at Mia as if she were the only living thing in a world of ghosts, Freya chose a different path. She chose cruelty. If Hunter won't let her go, she whispered to the freezing wind, then I will make sure she simply disappears. This time, she wouldn't leave it to fate. It happened at dusk when the sky was bleeding into a bruised, messy purple. Mia had wandered out alone just for a heartbeat. She needed to breathe. She needed to escape the overwhelming, suffocating heat of the bond that was tightening around her chest every time Hunter was near. She didn't hear the footsteps. She didn't see the shadows closing in until it was far too late. A sudden, violent shove sent the world spinning. There was no time to react, no time to fight. Just a sharp, silent cry that died in her throat as she hit the water. The river swallowed her whole. It was dark. It was freezing. It was violent. Mia struggled, her body convulsing in a blind, primal panic. The current was a living thing, dragging her down, spinning her until she didn't know which way was the surface and which was the grave. Her lungs burned, a fire screaming for air she couldn't reach. She tried to scream. She tried to call out for the man who had promised she would never be alone again. But no sound came, just like always. As her strength began to fade, a terrifying familiarity settled over her. This helplessness, this crushing weight of silence, it was what she had lived with for years. She reached upward, her fingers clawing at a light she could no longer see. Maybe, she thought, as the cold began to feel like sleep, maybe this is how my story was always meant to end. Miles away, in the heart of the pack house, Hunter Nightfang froze. He didn't just feel it. It hit him like a physical blow to the chest, stopping his heart mid-beat. It was a phantom pain, a scream he felt in his own marrow. Fear, cold, drowning, Mia. His eyes snapped open, glowing with a lethal, predatory light. In the next heartbeat, he was gone. He didn't think. He didn't plan. He simply ran. He ran faster than any wolf in history, driven by a desperate, agonizing pull in his soul that told him his world was flickering out. He wasn't an alpha in that moment. He was a man who refused to let the silence take what was his. Chapter 7. The river was a monster, a wild and unforgiving beast that didn't care for pack laws or the lineage of alphas. Hunter reached the jagged edge of the bank just as the current dragged Mia under. He saw her only for a heartbeat. She was sinking, her strength exhausted, her fight finally failing her. In that moment, something inside the most ruthless man in the north didn't just snap. It shattered. Without a single thought for the freezing depths or the rocks hidden beneath the foam, he dove in. The cold was a blade against his skin, but it didn't matter. The current tried to tear him away, but it was nothing compared to the pull of the bond. He reached her just as her body went limp, her hand slipping from the light. When he finally wrapped his arm around her waist and pulled her against his chest, the world changed. She wasn't just his mate. She wasn't just a claim he had staked before his pack. In the freezing dark of that river, she became everything. Hunter dragged her onto the muddy bank, his own lungs burning, his limbs shaking with an adrenaline that felt like poison. He laid her on the ground, but she was still. She was far too still. His chest tightened, a physical ache so sharp it felt like a rib had broken. No. He shook her, his hands desperate, losing the calculated grace he was known for. Maya, look at me. Open your eyes. There was nothing. For the first time in his life, true fear hit him. Not the fear of a battle or the fear of an enemy, but the raw, soul-crushing terror of a silence that was permanent. Don't do this, he whispered. His voice was raw, stripped of its authority, sounding more like a prayer than a command. Don't you dare leave me. He pressed his forehead against hers, his eyes squeezed shut, gripping her as if he could force his own life into her lungs. The ruthless alpha of the North looked broken, a king kneeling in the mud for a girl the world had called worthless. Then, the silence broke. She coughed, a violent hacking sound as the river spilled from her lips. Her body jerked, her lungs desperately pulling in the cold night air. Hunter exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for an eternity. Mia's eyes fluttered open. She was weak, her vision blurred by the mist and the moonlight, but the first thing she saw was him. Hunter was so close. His face etched with a pain so intense it was almost unrecognizable. He moved his hand to her face, his touch hovering for a second, as if he were afraid she was a ghost that would vanish if he pressed too hard. You're not allowed to do that, he said. His voice was low, unsteady, and thick with an emotion he couldn't hide anymore. Mia blinked, still struggling to find her bearings. Her fingers reached out, weak and trembling, and gripped the wet fabric of his shirt. That tiny, fragile hold destroyed whatever remained of Hunter's control. He pulled her into him, crushing her against his chest, holding her with a ferocity that suggested he would never let her walk on her own again. You don't leave me, he murmured into her hair. It wasn't an alpha's order. It was the plea of a man who had almost lost his world. The roar of the river faded into the background. There was only the sound of two hearts trying to find the same rhythm. Mia looked up at him, still cradled in his arms, her face inches from his. Hunter's gaze dropped to her lips. In the silence of the forest, the tension was a living thing, heavy and unavoidable. Mia didn't pull away. She didn't resist. For the first time in a life defined by running and hiding, she wanted to stay. Hunter leaned in, closing the distance until their breath was one. But then, he stopped. His jaw tightened as he fought the primal urge to take what the bond was screaming for. He wasn't ready to let go, but he wasn't ready to break his own code of restraint. He pulled back slowly, his eyes dark with a hunger he chose to starve. But even as he created space, he kept her anchored in his arms. That restraint, that refusal to rush, felt more intense than any kiss could have been. He had saved her from the river. But as they sat there in the mud and the moonlight, they both knew that the real danger was only just beginning. Chapter 8. Hunter helped her stand, his movements steady and slow, as if she were made of the finest glass. But even when she was steady on her feet, his hand never left hers. As they walked back through the darkened woods, his grip remained firm. It was unyielding, an anchor in a world that had just tried to sweep her away. Anyone who saw them that night would understand one thing with absolute clarity. Mia Blackthorn was no longer untouchable. She was claimed. She was protected. She was his. But behind the gnarled trunks of the ancient trees, eyes of ice and envy watched their every move. Freya Voss stood in the shadows, her breath hitching in a throat tight with rage. Her plan had failed. Again. But this time, her anger didn't just burn. It transformed. It turned into something far more dangerous. It turned into war. The morning after the river incident, the very air in the territory felt different. The pack felt the shift in their marrow. Mia no longer walked the corridors as a ghost. Hunter no longer kept the calculated distance he was known for. That change alone was enough to rattle the foundations of the Moonvale pack. To Freya Voss, it was an abomination. She was a woman who knew that in their world, emotion was a liability, but strategy was a weapon. By midday, the horn sounded, a mandatory gathering, public, unavoidable. The entire pack assembled in the stone courtyard, warriors with scarred faces, elders with eyes full of tradition, and onlookers hungry for a scandal. Mia stood beside Hunter, her small frame dwarfed by his presence. She was quiet, as she always was, but today she didn't feel small. Freya stepped forward. moving with a predatory elegance that commanded the room. She was composed. She was deadly. She was exactly what a Luna was supposed to be. "If this girl is truly worthy of standing beside our alpha," Freya began, her voice carrying across the stones like a whip. She paused, her eyes locking onto Mia's with a cold, surgical precision. "Then she should prove it." A murmur rippled through the crowd, like wind through dry leaves. Hunter's expression darkened, his eyes flashing with a warning. "Say what you want, Freya," he said, his voice a low, lethal growl. Freya smiled, a calculated, thin-lipped expression that didn't reach her eyes. Let her shift. The silence that followed was heavy. It was immediate. It was a death sentence. All eyes turned to Mia. In their world, the shift was not just an act of power. It was identity. It was proof of soul. It was worth. And Mia had never shifted. Not once in her 25 years. Hunter stepped forward, putting his body between Mia and the judging eyes of his people. "This is pointless," he said, his voice dropping into a dangerous register. But Freya didn't flinch. Or is it the truth? She tilted her head, the mockery in her gaze visible to everyone. Is it that she isn't worthy of you at all? That she is a defect? A hollow shell with nothing inside? The words hit with the force of a physical blow. The crowd began to whisper, the sound growing louder and crueler with every passing second. "She can't shift! She's not a real wolf! She's nothing!" Mia's hands began to tremble. It wasn't weakness. It was the crushing weight of every memory, every moment she had been called worthless, rushing back to drown her all over again. She closed her eyes, reaching deep into the dark, silent spaces of her soul. She searched for the spark, for the fur, for the claws, for anything that would prove she belonged at his side. She reached until her spirit ached. But when she opened her eyes, the silence of the courtyard said everything. Nothing came. She was still just a girl, still just a ghost. And in the eyes of the pack, she was officially nothing. Chapter 9. The silence of the courtyard was broken not by a wolf's howl, but by a sound far more vicious, a laugh. Giselle stepped forward, her face twisted into a mask of pure, mocking delight. She didn't just see a sister in pain. She saw an opportunity to finally bury her. "How embarrassing," she said, her voice ringing out across the stone for everyone to hear. "This is who you chose, Alpha? This void? This hollow thing?" Behind her, Genevieve watched with the cold, silent satisfaction of a spider that had finally caught its prey. Freya stood to the side, her arms folded, victory already burning in her icy eyes. They thought they had won. They thought they had exposed Mia's worthlessness to the world, but they didn't realize that they weren't just attacking a girl. They were attacking a bond. Hunter's aura didn't just shift, it darkened, turning into something violent and unstable. Through their connection, he felt every shard of Mia's pain. He felt the weight of her humiliation, the cold sting of the laughter, and the exact moment her spirit began to splinter. And in that moment, the Alpha of the North reached his breaking point. Enough. The word wasn't a shout. It was a low, vibrating growl that seemed to pull the very air out of the courtyard. The laughter died instantly. The whispers vanished. The entire pack went still, paralyzed by the sheer force of the power radiating from their leader. Hunter stepped forward, his massive frame fully shielding Mia from the judging eyes of the crowd. He wasn't just standing near her. He was claiming the space around her as sacred ground. When he spoke again, his voice was cold, absolute, and carried the weight of a death sentence. "She does not need to prove anything to you." Freya's expression tightened, her composure finally beginning to slip. "Then what is she, Hunter?" she challenged, her voice trembling with a desperate kind of defiance. "If she cannot shift, if she has no voice, what is she to this pack?" Hunter didn't hesitate. He didn't look for approval from the elders or the warriors. He turned slightly, looking down at Mia, really looking at her, seeing the woman the rest of the world was too blind to recognize. Then he turned back to the crowd. "She is my mate." A collective gasp rippled through the air, followed by a shock so thick it was almost tangible. But Hunter wasn't finished. He let the revelation sink in, let it burn through their prejudices before he delivered the final blow. "And tonight, I will claim her." The atmosphere that evening was unlike anything the territory had ever known. It was charged, heavy with an anticipation that made the very walls of the pack house feel like they were breathing. Inside the Alpha's chambers, the world was reduced to the space between two people. Mia stood by the large hearth, her heart racing against her ribs. She didn't fully understand the ancient laws he had just invoked, but she felt the shift. She felt the pull of the bond, no longer a thread, but a heavy golden chain. Hunter stood across from her, his silhouette framed by the firelight. He looked like a man fighting a war within his own blood. "After tonight," he said, his voice slow and weighted with gravity, "everything changes. There is no going back, Mia. Do you understand?" Mia swallowed softly. Her fingers tightened around the notebook she always carried, the notebook that had been her only bridge to the world for so long. But as she looked at him, she didn't reach for her pen. For the first time in her life, words felt small. They felt unnecessary. Hunter stepped closer, his movements slow and careful, as if he were approaching a beautiful, wounded creature. He reached out, his fingers tilting her chin upward until she was forced to meet his gaze. "Look at me," he whispered. She did. And in that moment, the fear that had defined her existence vanished. In its place was something raw, something certain, trust. And that simple, silent trust was the one thing that broke the Alpha's last restraint. Chapter 10. When Hunter finally claimed her, the bond didn't just snap into place, it detonated. The power was ancient, wild, and utterly uncontrollable. It surged through Mia's veins like liquid starlight, a sharp, golden energy that pulsed through every fiber of her being. It tore through the barriers, it incinerated the seals, it shattered the curse that had held her captive for a decade. Mia's breath hitched, her body arched against the sheer force of the magic. And then, a sound escaped her lips. It was soft, it was broken, but it was real. "Hunter?" The world went completely, terrifyingly silent. Hunter froze, his heart stopping in his chest. He pulled back slightly, looking at her as if she were a miracle he wasn't allowed to touch. "Mia?" he whispered, his voice trembling with a disbelief that mirrored her own. Tears spilled over her lashes, hot and fast. This time, she didn't reach for her notebook. She didn't reach for a pen. She reached for him. I can speak," she whispered. Her voice was weak, unused to the air, but it was alive. It was the sound of a soul returning to its body. And in that single heartbeat, everything they thought they knew about the world changed forever. The next morning, the pack gathered in the courtyard. They expected a show of dominance. They expected to see the mute girl tucked away in the Alpha's shadow. But what they saw was a transformation. Mia stepped forward beside Hunter. She wasn't behind him. She wasn't hidden. She stood as an equal, her chin lifted, her eyes burning with a clarity that made the warriors stumble back. When she spoke, the entire courtyard turned to ice. "You all watched me suffer." The words landed like stones in a still pond. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Genevieve's face drained of color, turning a sickly, ghostly white. Giselle staggered, reaching for a pillar to steady herself, while Freya's jaw tightened until it looked like it might shatter. Mia's gaze moved across them, slow, deliberate, and unshaken. She wasn't looking for revenge. She was looking for the truth. "You called me nothing?" she said. Her voice was still new, still soft, but it carried the authority of a queen. "You mocked my silence. You enjoyed my pain, but you were wrong." Before anyone could react, one of the elders stepped forward, his eyes wide with shock. "Then speak, child," he commanded. "Tell us how a wolf born of alpha blood was silenced." And so, Mia did. She told them everything. She spoke of the night in the forest and the ancient dark magic that had stolen her voice. She spoke of the years of abuse and the calculated cruelty of her own family. She named names. She pointed to Genevieve and told the pack how her stepmother had sought a dark witch to twist fate and steal her birthright. The courtyard erupted. Outrage and disbelief collided, creating a storm of noise. Genevieve stepped forward, her voice high and desperate, a jagged scream of denial. "She's lying! This is a trick, a spell! She is nothing!" But Mia didn't flinch. She didn't need to argue. Instead, she raised her hand, her palm open to the sky. She reached for the power that had been buried under the curse, the strength of the Blackthorn line that had been waiting for its moment to rise. And for the first time in her life, power answered. Chapter 11. The air didn't just shift, it vibrated. Deep within Mia, a force that had been suppressed for a decade finally tore through the last of its chains. It was an ancient power, one that had been sleeping in the dark, waiting for the silence to break. Her eyes began to glow, a brilliant, unnatural silver that burned with the intensity of 1,000 stars. Hunter stiffened beside her. He didn't pull away in fear. He stood still in a moment of pure, raw realization. He felt the weight of her bloodline as it finally claimed its host. Alpha blood, someone whispered, the words trembling through the crowd. Mia's power pulsed outward in a visible wave of energy, dominant and undeniable. And then the human girl vanished. In her place stood a creature of myth. She was perfect. A massive wolf, her coat the color of moonlight on winter snow, stood where Mia had once been. She was elegant, she was deadly, and she radiated an authority that made the very ground beneath her paws seem to bow. Every wolf in the courtyard, from the youngest pup to the most battle-hardened warrior, lowered their heads instinctively. They weren't just looking at a Luna. They were looking at a queen. Genevieve fell to her knees, her face a mask of crumbling disbelief. No, this isn't possible. But the truth is a stubborn thing. The power had awakened, the lies had been incinerated, and there was nowhere left for a traitor to hide. Hunter stepped forward, his voice sounding like the final strike of a hammer on an anvil. Genevieve Blackthorn, for the crimes of treason, the use of dark magic, and the abuse of a daughter of this pack, you are banished from this territory, effective immediately. Genevieve's scream was a jagged, broken thing that echoed off the stone walls. Giselle followed behind her, sobbing and begging for a mercy that no longer existed. But no one listened. They were stripped of their names, their status, and their pride, dragged away by the very guards who had once served them. But Freya Voss was not a woman who knew how to lose gracefully. She didn't kneel. She didn't beg. In a final, desperate act of madness, she lunged. With her claws out and a snarl of pure hatred, she struck toward the silver wolf. She never reached her. Hunter moved with a speed that defied the eye. He caught Freya midair and slammed her into the dirt with a violence that shook the courtyard. His eyes burned with a feral, lethal light. "You should have known better," he growled. Freya gasped, the air leaving her lungs as her pride finally shattered into fear. "I was meant to be Luna," she choked out. Hunter's voice dropped to a level that was cold as death itself. "You were never chosen?" With that, the last of the pretenders was exiled. But just as the weight of the justice began to settle, the air changed again. It grew darker, heavier. The sunlight seemed to drain from the sky, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. A low voice echoed through the clearing, appearing to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. So, the little Luna finally awakened. The ground trembled. From the deepest shadows of the surrounding forest, he emerged. Malric, the feral king. He was ancient, his presence corrupted by a darkness that made the skin crawl. He stepped into the light, a cruel, knowing smile twisting his lips. "Do you really think this is over?" Hunter stepped in front of Mia instantly, his body a shield, his growl a warning that shook the trees. But Malric's gaze stayed fixed on the silver wolf. "Your power, Mia Blackthorn," the king whispered, his eyes gleaming with a hunger that spanned centuries. "It was always meant for me."
Chapter 12. What followed was a storm of blood and silver. The air grew thick with the scent of ozone and ancient magic as wolves shifted and warriors charged, the very ground trembling under the weight of a war centuries in the making. Malric moved like a shadow given form. He was fast, unnatural, and devoid of mercy. Hunter met him head-on, a collision of feral strength against corrupted power that sent shockwaves through the clearing. But something was wrong. Hunter's movements were heavy, his strikes fractionally slowed by the lingering weight of the curse that still clawed at his heart. He staggered, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Malric laughed, a sound like dry bones grinding together. "You're still broken, Alpha," the feral king mocked, his eyes gleaming with a lethal light. "You are a king with a shattered crown." In that moment, Hunter faltered. The darkness began to close in. "Mia, run!" Hunter's voice was a desperate rasp, a plea from a man who was prepared to die so she could live. But Mia didn't run. For the first time in a life defined by fear and hiding, she stepped forward. She didn't move as a victim or as someone in need of a shield. She stepped forward as power itself. Her silver wolf surged, growing larger and more brilliant until the moonlight seemed to emanate from her own skin. She stepped between Hunter and the king, her presence a wall of shimmering authority. And then her voice rang out, not as a whisper, but as a command that shook the trees. He is not broken. In that instant, the bond between them didn't just pulse, it ignited. It wasn't the old bond of dominance or the desperate pull of a protector. It was something new. It was unity. It was the realization that they were two halves of a single unstoppable force. That was the missing piece. The moment Mia chose him, not as her master, but as her equal, the curse that had plagued Hunter's lineage for generations simply shattered. It didn't just break, it ceased to exist. Hunter's power exploded, freed from its chains at last. His wolf let out a roar so loud and so primal that the very stars seemed to tremble. This time, he didn't fight to protect a girl. He fought alongside a queen. Malric attacked again, his movements frantic and desperate, but he was already a ghost. Mia struck first with a blinding silver speed that left no room for error. Hunter followed, a relentless tide of dominant power. Together, they were perfect. They were the balance of Alpha and Luna, of strength and voice. They overwhelmed the feral king in a blur of fur and fang. Malric fell, his corrupted body collapsing into a cloud of ash and dust, blown away by a wind that finally felt clean. The darkness was over. Days later, the territory gathered one last time. There was no fear in the courtyard now. There was no mockery, no judgment. There was only a silence born of deep, unyielding respect. Mia stood before her people, radiant and unshaken. Hunter was beside her. He wasn't standing above her or ahead of her. He stood at her shoulder, his hand resting on the small of her back. A silent acknowledgement of the woman who had saved him. When Mia spoke, every soul in the pack listened as if their lives depended on it. "I was silenced once," she said, her voice steady and full of a quiet, regal strength. She took a breath, looking out over the faces of those who had once called her nothing, but never again. The pack bowed. They didn't do it out of duty or because their alpha commanded it. They bowed because they believed in the queen who had found her voice in the heart of a storm. Under the light of a full triumphant moon, Mia Blackthorn stood crowned. She wasn't crowned by a golden circle or a marriage contract. She was crowned by the truth. The girl who couldn't speak now ruled them all with a voice that would never be forgotten. And beside her, the alpha who had almost lost his soul finally had everything he ever needed. His Luna. His equal. His queen. Thanks for listening. If you love this story, subscribe, like, and share. For a heart-stopping story, I will love to hear you taught in the comment section below on your favorite part of the story. Until then, see you in the next one.